Everybody has a reason, I suppose, though some are better than others. Maybe you've heard of the pious man. He reached the age of 105, suddenly stopped going to church. Always been a faithful attender, and so the preacher went to see him, and he asked him, "How come we don't see you in church anymore?" And the old man lowered his voice, and he whispered, "Preacher, when I got to be 90, I expected the Lord to take me home any day. Then I got to be 95, and then 100, and now 105. So I figured God is very busy and must have forgotten about me, and I don't want to remind him." Then we think of a woman who said to her pastor one day, she hoped that he didn't take offense when her husband walked out during his sermon. The preacher said, "Well, I was a little worried about it." And she said, "No, Pastor, Ralph has been walking in his sleep ever since he was a child." Reminds me of this terrible pun on a church sign. What do you call a sleepwalking nun? A Roman Catholic. Sort of like a little boy that tugged on his mother's arm to ask her a question during a particularly long and boring sermon, not here at Christ Church, of course. When she bent over to hear him, he said in a too loud whisper, all around him could hear, "Mama, are you sure this is the only way to go to heaven?" That's a pretty good question. None of us would actually say you have to go to church in order to go to heaven. Sort of like you have to go to Atlanta if you want to fly anywhere else in the southeast. But what some folks may wish to know is whether or not attending worship every week, making church going a regular habit, custom in our lives, getting involved in its missions and its ministries, is really all that important anymore. Well, whenever we find ourselves pondering that question, maybe it's appropriate to step back and remember a little story from the Old Testament. Just a few verses out of 2 Chronicles 27, about a king named Jotham. Let me read those verses to you just in case you have not been trolling around in 2 Chronicles recently. Verses 1 and 2, and then verse 6. Jotham was 25 years old when he became king. He reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. His mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father Uzziah had done. But unlike him, he did not enter the temple of the Lord. And the people continued their corrupt practices. Jotham grew powerful because he walked steadfastly before the Lord his God. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You look at his life, it's clear Jotham had certain sterling qualities and personal attributes that would demand admiration and praise in every age. He was a king, for instance, not just by accident of his birth, but he was a king by right of his ability as well. Jotham had real gifts and qualities of leadership that would make him a good executive of any organization. He was energetic, he was willing to work hard, but even better, he believed he was put on this earth not just to be ministered to, but to minister to others. He refused to be a parasite. He understood power is always given for a purpose in his life. And so being the king of his people, he was called to be not only their overlord and their ruler, but to be their protector and their warrior as well, to look after their interests, not just his own interest. That's probably why Jotham built not only fortresses for the people of Israel to be protected in, and cities in which they were to live, but he was concerned enough about the spiritual welfare of his people that he saw the church, such as it was in his day, if we can project that term backwards in history a little bit, he saw the church not as a liability, but as a clear asset. And thus, so minded, Jotham even contributed to the church after a fashion. He built one of its gates. He donated what we might be the equivalent of a fine pipe organ, or maybe a substantial contribution to the annual operating pledge drive. As you see, in truth, Jotham, whose name his very name meant God is honest. Jotham was a man of fine character. The Chronicle even tells us that he ordered his life before the Lord his God. That is to say, he possessed a sense of the Almighty. He lived every day of his life conscious of the eye of his Maker being upon him. And thus, as verse 6 tells us, he walked steadfastly before the Lord his God. That doesn't mean he was perfect. Nobody on this earth has ever been perfect. I remember hearing one pastor once asked rhetorically in a sermon if anyone had ever heard of an absolutely perfect person, and one man raised his hand. He said, "You know of a perfect person?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Who is it?" He said, "My wife's first husband." Well, he wasn't perfect. Neither was our young King Jotham. But if we may conclude anything at all about Jotham from this short chapter devoted to him in the Bible, we may determine that the main bent of his life was toward goodness. He was what folks of an age used to call an able, honest, God-fearing kind of guy. And yet, having said all of that, there was one little thing about Jotham that was not so good. And the writer of the Scriptures tells us of it here, almost apologetically, so it seems. It's not that Jotham was corrupt, as so many of the kings of that time were. It's not that he was hypocritical or narrow-minded or arrogant or intolerant. All in all, Jotham was a great guy. But, according to verse 2, he did not enter into the temple of the Lord. Helped pay for it. Never went in it. And as troubling as that might seem to some folks here this morning, in a time in which the majority of our friends and neighbors will not be in any church this Sunday, Jotham's great omission was truly a good man's blunder. Some would say it was a fatal flaw. Because his singular act of omission led to some tragic consequences, not only for himself, but for those all around him, even those of whom he would govern, as we're going to see very shortly. Now, we might wonder, so why did Jotham go to church? All kinds of reasons why folks don't come to services. Some years ago, a newspaper invited its readers to send in their responses to the statement, "Why I don't go to church." After several replies had been received, the writer of the story decided to cast their alibis in a slightly different light. He simply substituted the word movies for wherever the word church appeared in their letters. So when the story came out, the writer reported thus that one reader said, "I'm out of the habit of going to the movies. That's why I don't go anymore." Another one wrote, "I know a man who's gone to the movies for years and he is still no better than I am." Another one said, "I don't go to the movies because I find there are just as many good people outside the movies as inside the movies." One even said, "I stay away from the movies because I was forced to go to them as a child." I think if you'd asked King Jotham why he never went to the temple, he wouldn't have offered you any of those rather lame excuses or reasons. He was too honest for that. He would not even have said that he didn't go to the church of his time because there were too many hypocrites in the place. Rather, I suspect he would have told you, first of all, he didn't enter into the temple simply because, being perfectly blunt, he didn't feel any real need for it. Jotham was like so many very people in our time, young and successful, just 25 when he became king. His hands overflowing with big and even worthwhile tasks. He was busy organizing armies and building cities and shaping the destiny of a nation and probably having a family. "Doing good is my religion," he might have said. And that's a pretty positive thing. Jesus himself was a busy man. His hands were full of great deeds. Acts 10:38 records Jesus went about doing good. But then the Bible also tells us that he was busy as he was. Jesus was never too busy to attend church. The very Son of God routinely went up to the synagogue on the Lord's Day, as was his custom, Luke 4 says. And unfortunately, that's where Jotham was not quite like Jesus. For in addition to being busy and not feeling the need to be in worship, I think there was another reason why Jotham neglected the house of the Lord. He may never have admitted it even to himself, but I have a feeling that when it came down to it, despite all of his positive contributions, Jotham stayed away from the house of the Lord because he was more than just a little prejudiced against the church of his time and even mad at the church of his time. Why? Read back the chapter earlier, you'll see that Jotham's father, Uzziah, was a devoutly religious man. He was also a man who loved power. He loved it so much that one day, swollen with pride, Uzziah dared to take upon himself the sacred office of the priest. Then when the real priest, that is to say the priest who had been called, consecrated by God for that office, rebuked him, Uzziah became so exceedingly angry that his face turned red with rage until, in fact, the mark of leprosy became clearly visible upon his forehead. Uzziah was compelled to leave the temple, spend the rest of his life in isolation, in retirement. And Jotham, his son, never forgot that horrible experience. I'm sure he knew in his heart that it was not the priest who gave his father leprosy, nor was it the church. But in his heart, Jotham nursed a prejudice against the house of the Lord and its ministers thereafter. And there are plenty of folks like that out there this morning, aren't there? You know them. People who have dropped out of church because they've been disappointed with it or with its leaders. People who have found its membership or its ministers to be too imperfect to meet their high expectations. Even some folks who have sadly enough been injured or hurt by pastors or parishioners who abuse their trust and their confidence. So like Jotham, there are people who do not enter the church today, or at best come only infrequently. Maybe you know someone like that today. Maybe you are someone like that this morning. But if so, we should notice the outcome of Jotham's great omission. Jotham, by not entering the temple, neither destroyed the church or himself in the process. But he missed out on something through which God would have wanted to bless him. More significantly, his failure to be in the Lord's house had an impact upon other people. The people of the land, we are told, continued their corrupt practices, as the older versions put it. They did yet corruptly. Just for all those who admired the good king, they followed his example to the letter. They joined him in ignoring the worship of the living God. The land may have been secured, the Ammonites might have been conquered, the economy may have been skyrocketing, the stock market may have performed better than anyone's expectations. But there was something still very wrong in the land of Israel. Increasingly, its people were spiritually bankrupt. And while Jotham may have made it to the heavenly harbor safely, his people became shipwrecked on the way. His very own son Ahaz, who succeeded him on the throne of David, Ahaz made cast idols for worshiping the Baals, the false gods, burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom. Ahaz sacrificed his own sons, Jotham's grandchildren, in the fire, following the detestable practices of the ways of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. Until finally, 2 Chronicles 28 tells us, the Lord handed Ahaz over to the king of Aram, who defeated him and took many of his people as prisoners. Jotham ended up all right with the Lord, but those who followed after him, both in time and in spirit, they paid the price for their ignorance about following the Lord. The tragedy of Jotham's life was not so much in the positive harm he did. It was in the positive good he failed to do. He didn't fight the church. He simply failed to give it his support and to help lead it in any aggressive battle for righteousness. And we have to wonder, don't we? How many Jothams are out there today? Good people, fair people, honest people, but people who have put church going at the very bottom of their priority list. On the other hand, I think of another old pious man. His name was C.K. Barrett, Charles Kingsley Barrett. He was a British biblical scholar, incredible interpreter of God's word, who taught at Durham in England. I read his books long ago in seminary. I've used his commentaries. And then when my daughter lived in Durham, I met Professor Barrett. He was 94, almost blind, almost deaf, crippled and hunched over, a widower. And he climbed the steep steps to the North Road Methodist Church in Durham every Sunday to be there. I got to preach there one Sunday, and Professor Barrett came in, and he sat in the back. I thought, he can't hear me? He can barely see me? He looks like he's in pain. Why are you here? Afterwards, he told me that he liked my sermon, and I thought, really? And I said, Professor Barrett, I'm just so impressed that you are here. You know what he said? I come so people know whose side I'm on. If people were to look at you and your worship, would they be able to tell whose side you're on? You can be a Christian without being involved in church. I have no doubt about that. But it's sort of like being a student without going to school, or a scientist who doesn't share his findings, or playing a tuba without an orchestra or band all around you. It's possible. But you have to ask the question, why? Why would you want to do such a thing as that? So I want to invite you this morning to think a little bit more about how to make worship of the living God a regular part of your routine. In your worship guide today, there is a little flap on the back that you can tear off. We're going to invite you to take a few moments right now to look at this and check everything you can. Anybody can do anything here. I'm amazed sometimes when I look and I see, why do we have the same people always reading scripture or serving communion? Because others don't know that they can? Well, you can. You just have to tell us. We need people to usher. We need people to greet. We've got people at the doors, but we don't have enough people at all the doors sometimes. We need people to help with the audio-visual streaming team, and you don't have to even know how to do it. They'll teach you. You'll be as smart as a seventh grader in no time. We need people to make those video announcements, to be on the prayer team, to sing or play in the praise band. All of those are ways. Look at the first one. It all begins with, I'm going to be in worship. I'm going to be in worship 2, 3, 4 times a month. That doesn't mean you can't be sick, you can't go on vacation, doesn't mean you can't be out. It just means my intention is I'm going to be here all the time. All the time I'm here and I'm able, I'm going to be here. We're going to take a few moments, think about these things, fill these out, and then when you come for the Lord's Supper, I invite you to bring them up, and there'll be 2 baskets in the front. Drop them in there. This is the first part of any stewardship program. This is how we give it up for God. It was a great omission indeed, which the young King Jotham made so long ago. Yet when your story and mine is written one day, if nowhere else but in the book of life, will it read any differently from his? He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but he did not enter into the temple of the Lord. And the people yet did corruptly. May our story not be so. May it not be so indeed. Amen.